22 happens to be for Judah and Jerusalem. So there's 11 nations that God gives this proclamation of judgment to, and it's because they have turned pagan. They have turned away from Him or never acknowledged Him, either way. And so if you were an individual that lived in Judah at that point in time, and you hear all of these going on, because if you go back to, I think it starts in 15, I believe 15 is the first one maybe. No, go back to 13. 13 you have Babylon. So if you're Judah and you're hearing all of these different statements that are being made by God through Isaiah, and all of them are judgments for surrounding countries, you could get this idea that, hey, we're doing something right, all these other countries are doing something wrong, and therefore God's finally kind of punishing them for what they've been doing. And then you get to 22, and God speaks through Isaiah about the coming judgment for Jerusalem. Now, there's two different groups of people that God uses, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But God now speaks through Isaiah the judgment that's coming. And so Judah has no way to necessarily be proud or think more of themselves that they're better than someone around them, because God's now saying, it's coming to you too. So Isaiah 22 is this proclamation of what's going to come and the reasons behind that very thing. So let's look at verse 1, and then we'll come back and share some thoughts, go through our questions with it. So verse 1 says, the oracle concerning the valley of vision. And the reason Isaiah starts in that way, the valley of vision, is Isaiah actually left Jerusalem and went down into a valley, and God gave him all of these visions there. So he's referencing where he's at when he's receiving this vision, is what he's doing. It says, what do you mean that you have gone up, all of you, to the housetops, you who are full of shoutings, tumultuous city, exultant town? Your slain are not slain with the sword or dead in battle. All your leaders have fled together. Without the bow, they were captured. All of you who were found were captured, though they had fled far away. Therefore I said, look away from me. Let me weep bitter tears. Do not labor to comfort me concerning the destruction of the daughter of my people. For the Lord God of hosts has a day of tumult and trampling and confusion in the valley of vision, a battering down of walls and a shouting to the mountains. And Elam bore the quiver with chariots and horsemen, and Kir uncovered the shield. The choicest valleys were full of chariots, and the horsemen took their stand at the gates. He has taken away the covering of Judah. In that day you looked to the weapons of the house of the forest, and you saw that the breaches of the city of David were many. You collected the waters of the lower pool, and you counted the houses of Jerusalem, and you broke down the houses to fortify the wall. You made a reservoir between the two walls for the water of the old pool, but you did not look to him who did it, or see him who planned it long ago. In that day the Lord God of hosts called for weeping and mourning, for baldness and wearing sackcloth. And behold, joy and gladness, killing oxen and slaughtering sheep, eating flesh and drinking wine. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. The Lord of hosts has revealed himself in my ears. Surely this iniquity will not be atoned for you until you die, says the Lord God of hosts. Thus says the Lord God of hosts, come, go to this steward, to Shebna, who is over the household, and say to him, what have you to do here, and whom have you here that you have cut out here a tomb for yourself? You who cut out a tomb on the height and carve a dwelling for yourself in the rock. Behold, the Lord will hurl you away violently, O you strong man. He will seize firm hold on you and whirl you around and throw you like a ball into a wide land. There you shall die, and there shall be your glorious chariots, you shame of your master's house. I will thrust you from your office, and you will be pulled down from your station. In that day I will call my servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and I will clothe him with your robe, and will bind your sash on him, and will commit your authority to his hand. And he shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. And I will place on his shoulder the key of the house of David. He shall open, and none shall shut, and he shall shut, and none shall open. And I will fasten him like a peg in a secure place, and he will become a throne of honor to his father's house. And they will hang on him the whole honor of his father's house, the offspring and issue, every small vessel, from the cups to the flagons. In that day, declares the Lord of hosts, the peg that was fastened in a secure place will give way, and it will be cut down and fall, and the load that was on it will be cut off, for the Lord has spoken. This last few verses where it speaks of Eliakim is actually thought to be a foreshadowing of Christ and what Christ would be. If you notice that it says, verse 22, I will place on his shoulder the key of the house of David. He shall open, none shall shut. He shall shut, and none shall open. This was somewhat of a Old Testament example of Christ. However, it was not Christ, because you see that ultimately he ends up dying. He's gone from this earth. And after he dies, then the faithfulness that he declared and showed to the people is gone. But he is somewhat of and I want to use this term very lightly, but he's somewhat of a savior that comes in after a terrible guy was in place. This Shebna was a terrible man. He had no faith in God. He did not lead by pointing people to God. He actually tried to build up a treasure for himself. This tomb that it talks about, he actually built himself a monument of a tomb that he could be buried in, so that people after he's dead and gone would look and they would think that he was all that just by looking at the monument that he had built. Now what God does is he doesn't even allow him to be buried in that tomb, because he's taken captive. He dies while he's captive and he doesn't get to go there. There's some that speculate based on some other texts that connect with this, that he actually used money from the treasury to build this. It wasn't his own private money even. So he was just a terrible guy. And so this Eliakim replaces him. God puts him in place. And Eliakim actually leads well. He leads faithfully. And so that's why you find this statement of he shall open, none shall shut, he shall shut, and none shall open. That's the same statement that you see referenced in Revelation when it talks about Jesus Christ as well. So just a little bit of a precursor to Christ that's mentioned here in the text. Now let's go back to the first of the chapter and we'll talk through. Looking at our first question, God pronounces judgment through Isaiah to 11 different nations. We talked about that a minute ago. Judah was one of them. What group of people would bring judgment on Judah from God? Was there only one group, and were they able to capture Jerusalem? So what are the two, or are there two, are there more than one group of people that God uses to bring judgment on Judah?
Was Elam one of them?
No. We've talked about both of the groups for the last several weeks. One of them starts with an A, the other one starts with a B. The Syrians and the Babylonians. The Syrians were the first group. Were the Syrians able to take Jerusalem? No, they were not. So God, in his protective nature, but yet righteous judgment nature, allows the Assyrians to come in, and they go so far, but they get up to Jerusalem, and God says, you're not going any further. And he doesn't let them take Jerusalem, but he does let them take captive many who are just living in Judah. And then a period of time goes by and you get to about 593, somewhere in there, BC. So this is before Christ ever came. And you have the Babylonians that come in. And of course, this would be the time frame where you have the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel, and all of those individuals. And in that time frame, Babylon comes in, and they do take Jerusalem. And so this is a reference, chapter 22 is a reference to the time when Babylon would actually come in and would take not only Judah, but they would take Jerusalem as well. So the Babylonians were able to capture Jerusalem. The Assyrians were not. So there were two different groups of people. You would have thought from the Assyrians, that time of judgment, that Judah would have learned and Jerusalem would have learned, and they would have turned around and they wouldn't have fell back into this way, but they did. They didn't learn from previous mistakes. And we talk sometimes about how history repeats itself. It only repeats itself if we make the same mistakes that our predecessors made, and they did make the same mistakes. They chose paganism over worshiping the one true God. Any questions on that at all? So the Assyrians were the first group that came in that God used to bring judgment on them. And then the Babylonians were the second group. And the Babylonians were able to take Jerusalem. Okay, question 2 then. From verse 13, what was the philosophy of the people of Judah, and what's dangerous about this type of thought? So, verse 13 says, "And behold, joy and gladness, killing oxen, slaughtering sheep, eating flesh, drinking wine. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die."
I thought they were in pretty good shape, better than those people around them.
Okay. Or they either thought that they had done all they could do, and we might as well just sit back and enjoy life. Any other thoughts about it? What's dangerous about this line of thought? Everything. Do we find it going on today?
Yeah.
You look at people that, they work Monday through Friday, and there's actually songs written about it too, and they live for the weekend. And the weekend comes and they just go out and enjoy life and do whatever. And then they have to hit it again Monday morning, to go back to work kind of thing.
Because society tells us we deserve it. We deserve me time.
Mm.
And we buy into that frame of mind that you get caught up in all about me.
Mm-hmm. What's missing here? Because, this is a point where they actually see that the enemy's coming. We didn't reread this, but if you look at verses, starting verse 8 through 12, or 8 through 11 anyway, talks about all the preparations that they were making for this coming enemy that they know is coming. And so they make all these preparations, and then they just sit down and say, all right, we've done what we can do. Let's see what happens, kind of thing. What's missing in that line of thought?
They didn't look to God for any type of guidance or planning.
Yeah, they didn't look to God. It's almost like there's a reverence, a lack of reverence, and a lack of the good fear, I'm going to say, of God. That understanding, we've kicked around, the sovereignty of God. Understanding that God is in control of all things, it's almost like they said, okay, we've done all we can do. We're just going to kick back and we're going to see what happens now. And it's almost as if they're saying, God doesn't have anything to do with this. This is all just the Babylonians that are coming after us, and we're going to make all the preparations we can make, but then we'll just see who's stronger in the end. And they don't turn to God. Although there is some thought that they kind of have this loose faith in God to where they basically say, well, God will take care of us. And they have this very lackadaisical view. So there's kind of two line of thoughts with this. One is they have this kind of lackadaisical view of, well, God will take care of it. We'll just do these things and then we'll sit back and just let him deal with it kind of thing. Or we're going to do what we do and we're just going to see what happens. And they don't think of God at all. It would be hard for them not to have a little bit of the idea of God in them, especially if it's the Babylonian invasion, because the Syrians just invaded earlier, and God's whole reason for that was to try to get them back to thinking about him. And you're, less than 200 years now, 100, really more like 100 years probably, from the Assyrian invasion to the Babylonian one. And so it would be hard for them not to have some idea that God's not involved in this. So let's think about it from the standpoint of that they just say, okay, God's going to take care of it. We'll do these preparations we see, and then we'll sit back and we'll just let him handle it. Is there anything wrong with that line of thought? Because from that sense, they've not necessarily forgotten God, so to speak, but are they really trusting him?
Well, the thing between man and God is a working relationship. I mean, he does his part, you're supposed to do your part.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't do your part, you think, well, maybe they're just not that interested in it.
You could almost, in some way, see where they might be thinking in their mind, well, I'm going to do my part. It talks about these reservoirs that they build. Like they're preparing to be surrounded is what they're doing. Go back to, let's read verse 8 through 11 again. It says, he has taken away the covering of Judah. And that day you looked to the weapons of the house of the forest, and you saw that the breaches of the city of David were many. So in other words, they look around at the wall around Jerusalem and they say, there's a lot of places they could break in here. It'd be like you walking through your house and saying, well, that window doesn't lock and we can't lock this door. We need to fix these areas so that people can't break in here. Verse 9, you saw that the breached city of David were many. You collected the waters of the lower pool. In other words, they're making preparation to be surrounded to where they can't go out and get water. So they're trying to make sure they have enough water within this city wall so that they could survive for a long period of time. Verse 10, and you counted the houses of Jerusalem, and you broke down the houses to fortify the wall. Now you might think this is a little bit drastic here. They're tearing people's houses down now so that they can have the lumber to go fortify the wall. Now, granted, you would do that if you thought an enemy was coming and you could fortify it and keep it out if you felt like that was the right thing to do. Verse 11, you made a reservoir between the two walls for the water of the old pool. So in other words, they looked at this first collection of water they had, the lower pool, and they said, this is probably not going to be enough. So in between, there was an inner wall and an outer wall. In between those two walls, there was another source of water. And so they make a reservoir there, and they say, well, we'll make sure, so we'll do this work. So this is not that they sat down and done nothing. They didn't just sit down and say, God will take care of it and have no thought at all. But then if you look at the end of verse 11, it says, but you did not look to him who did it or see him who planned it long ago. In other words, you're making these reservoirs of water, but you did not look to the one that actually made water to begin with. Like they did not look to God for that. And then verse 12 goes on to say, what God was looking for from you was actually mourning, weeping, baldness, wearing sackcloth, acknowledging your sin, that you've done wrong, and being sorrowful about that is what God was looking for. But instead, what he finds is joy and gladness, killing of oxen, slaughtering of sheep, eating flesh, drinking wine, and this statement, let us eat, drink, and be, well, for tomorrow we die. God's looking for them to be remorseful about especially what's about to happen, but just their spiritual state. And instead, he finds this action of, okay, they've done work, kind of like you said, like there is a working relationship between man and God. We can't just sit down and do nothing. So they've done work, but their mind, their heart, I should say, their heart is not, okay, God, we've put in the preparation, but we know that we've done wrong along the way. So we're coming before you now, and we're begging of you to take care of us. It was almost as if this, and y'all have heard me say this before, it's what Paul says, I think in Corinthians, where he says that we should not presume upon grace. It's almost as if that's what they're doing. They're saying, okay, we're going to do this physical preparation, but then God's going to take care of it from there. And they don't acknowledge their sin. They don't acknowledge that they should be sorrowful. They don't acknowledge that, we better get on our knees and we better be asking God to help us. Like we've done all we can do physically, but there's something much greater than us that could take this thing over and could totally wipe out the Babylonians, and we never even see them because he's done that before. And they're not acknowledging any of that. And what he says is, instead of mourning, they're rejoicing. Well, what are they rejoicing about? Are they rejoicing that an enemy's coming? I mean, it doesn't seem like the right thing to do, does it?
They'd done all they could do. They thought they'd done all they could do.
Thought they had.
A commentary says they took a fatalistic attitude toward life and said, let us eat, drink, and be merry, instead of repenting and turning to the calling on the Lord for help. They held their pardon.
Paul, I think when I preached on this text, I think I brought up that this phrase is used, I think it's 4 other times. I didn't look that up again. I think it's 4 other times in the Bible that this phrase is used. Paul uses it once in Corinthians. And he's talking from the standpoint of, okay, if there is no Christ, no resurrection, then why not eat, drink, and be merry? Because there's no life after this, so why not enjoy life today? And of course, Paul says that rhetorically because he says, but there is an afterlife. There is an eternity that we have to think about. So we don't need to be this mindset of eat, drink, be merry, and just enjoy life, because we do have to think about the eternal. And so it's the same thing here, like what Susie just said. They're in the mindset of, hey, we've only got one life to live. We might as well live it up right now. Do we find ourselves getting caught up, maybe at a younger age, getting caught up into this mindset of that very thing of, hey, I've only got one life to live. I'm only going to be a teenager once. I'm only going to be in college once. I think there's a lot of mentalities in college of like, this is a time that I'm only going to experience one time, so I might as well live it up the way that I can. And I don't want to be negative just toward, I say negative, I don't want to be hard on just agri people, because when we get into our young adult age, before we have children, and we think, okay, let's enjoy life while we don't have kids, because we're going to have kids for the next however many years, so let's live up on life, Now, some of you didn't go that route. You had kids early and you didn't. And then maybe after we get to that empty nest time, we think, hey, let's enjoy life. Kids are out of the house, and we can just go on, and we don't have to think about much. But God's saying here, look, no matter where you are, the overall thought here is, no matter where you are, you can't forget the Creator. You can't forget the one that, in this case, the water, the reservoirs that they were trying to stockpile themselves, you can't forget the one that actually created it. And you're not even acknowledging it to begin with. So you've done all this prep work. You've done what you thought you should do, but there's no humbling before God here. So, this line of thought is very dangerous, even though it seems like a statement that really doesn't have much harm in it. Like, let's eat and drink, and tomorrow we may die, and so let's enjoy life today. It doesn't seem like that has such a negative thought to it, but it really does, because we're not acknowledging eternity when we do that. And we're not saying, I better make sure that I'm right with the Lord here, because there is a time after here that I've got to think about. Any questions or comments down through there? All right, question 3 then. From verse 2, how did Isaiah see that the people would die? So look back to verse 2 of our text. Verse 2 says, "You are full of shoutings, tumultuous city, exultant town. Your slain are not slain with the sword or dead in battle." So if there's a fear that they're going to be surrounded, they're trying to stockpile goods, if you want to call it that. And Isaiah says, you're not slain with the sword and you're not dead in battle. What's the thought here then of how they're going to die?
Starvation, disease,
Famine, yeah.
stress.
They're basically, and we don't like to think about it often, but Jerusalem through the years went through some very terrible times. This would have been one of them. But when the Romans took them over, it was really, really bad. They began they turned to cannibalism. That's what they did. And
Kind of like they're creating their own little prison. I mean,
Yeah.
all they have to do is wait them out. How long can they survive in them?
yeah, that's literally what happened, especially with the Romans, but with the Babylonians, apparently that's what happened as well. And so Isaiah sees this. And I want to skip for just a moment down to we'll get there in a minute. Never mind. So Isaiah sees this and he says, you're not dying hand-to-hand physical battle. You're fixing to die a painful death. That's what you're fixing to do. And then question 4, verses 8 through 11, what did the people do to try and prepare for the enemy? We've talked through that already. They built these reservoirs. They tried to stockpile things. Why did their preparations not work?
All physical, nothing spiritual, right?
Okay.
They kind of put all their trust in themselves. They were good.
Okay. Yep. Put their trust in themselves only. Although they may have, like vocally, they may have said, hey, God will take care of us, but it really wasn't a heartfelt deal. Yeah. Why else would they not work? Or did they not work? Because we weren't there, but let's assume for a minute that they fortified this wall like it had never been before, to where it would appear there's no way anybody could get in. And let's say that they had water out the wazoo. Just stockpiled to where it looks like there's no way we'll run out of water. What were they forgetting?
Trust in God.
They're forgetting their trust in God. Was it?
Usage is usage. It's only going to last so long, and you're going to procreate.
Who were they really, even though it's the Babylonian people coming, who were they really trying to prevent from coming in? Was it the Babylonian people, or was there something bigger than this going on? It's like physically it's the Babylonian people. But who were they actually trying to stop? Yeah,
God has a plan for our life, and it doesn't matter what we do, we're not gonna change his plan for our life.
yeah.
He's already got that worked out, and we may think that we're going to, but his plan is his plan.
So they're making all these preparations trying to stop Babylonians. What they've forgotten is, like, God is more powerful than anything we can do. So no matter what we prepare for physically, I'm talking about human-wise, God is still, it's still going to happen because his judgment's coming. Yeah. So they're trying to prepare, and they've forgotten we can't stop God. And that's part of the issue is that very thing. And I think that becomes part of our issue today as well. Like our best laid plans as humans are minuscule in the eyes of God, and God can do whatever he needs to do to get our attention. Now, God doesn't just, and this is what we have to remember, God doesn't just randomly make decisions that, he had a purpose behind what he was doing, right? His purpose was to bring this group of people back to being faithful followers of his. So that's his whole plan in doing all of this, that there would be a remnant that would come through. Obviously, there's going to be some people die out here, but there's a remnant that's going to come through. That's his whole purpose in this. So when we think about in our life today, we have to remember that God has a plan, but that plan has a purpose behind it. So it's not that he's just randomly doing something. He's trying to accomplish something, and it may be to bring our life back to where it needs to be. And if that's the case, and he's at the point where he's going to, impress that on us, then our best laid plans to avoid it is not going to do anything. All right, question 5 then. From the end of verse 11, what did they not do? And we've talked about this. They didn't look to him, the one who had created all things. And I feel like we are so ingrained in that mindset today that we don't. And I'm afraid that it's even worked its way into the church to some degree, that even as church people, we forget to look to the one that created all things, in times when we're not like intentionally thinking along that line. So we have to get ourselves back to where we do intentionally think the creator of all things is the one that's at work here. We have to, make that the center of our life. Question 6, what did God want them to do? If you look in verse 12, he called for weeping, he called for mourning, for baldness, for wearing sackcloth. That's what he wanted them to do. He wanted them to acknowledge that their life was not where it needed to be. They had failed, they had done wrong. It was a struggle for them to do. They didn't do it. Do we like doing this today? Let's just say that, how many of you like to admit when you're wrong? How many of you just say, man, I'm glad today I get to admit I am wrong about something? Probably not.
The things that Christian people, church people, give it over to the Lord. Okay, so a lot of our mindset is we say, turn that over to the Lord. People do, and then it's just like, we're not thankful of it, we don't continue to pray for guidance, we don't continue to, we should turn our worries and our cares over to the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
But it is not, here you go, and then go on our merry way.
Right.
Eat, drink, and be merry.
Right.
We are still to pray for guidance, seek the Lord's counsel, and to be thankful for our deliverance, should we, from that situation or that care, or that we're even able to carry our cares.
There's, we talk about sometimes, and I've said this, and probably a lot of ministers have, that, if you come to the altar, you pray where you are, regardless where you do this, and you leave your cares and burdens with him. Well, You know, let's assume that that care of that burden is because we messed up somewhere along the way. We've sinned. The consequences now we're dealing with. When we talk about that we should leave it with the Lord, that doesn't mean that we walk away and we say, all right, I'm done with that, moving on to something else, moving to the next one. You know, we still have to have a remorse about what we've done. And sometimes when we leave that care burden means that we have to get up from there and we have to go make it right with another person because we may have done another person wrong. And we have to actually admit that in some way or acknowledge it to them in some way. And if we don't, then we're doing what Susie just said. We're saying, all right, I'm bringing all my cares and burdens, leaving them here. All right, God's got it, I'm done. And that's not what he's looking for. You know, he's saying here, he's calling for weeping and mourning and baldness and wearing sackcloth. This was a process that they didn't just do for 5 minutes and then walk away. And we've regulated it down in some cases. I'm not saying everyone does this. I'm just saying in some cases, we've regulated it down, even among Christian people, to we step out, we walk this aisle, and for 5 minutes we're remorseful, and then we get up and we walk out the door and we just go about our married life. And that's not what God's called us to do. He's called us to truly be remorseful for sin, to truly be sorrowful for what we've done. Now, does that mean we live in it for the rest of our life? No, not necessarily. We may suffer the consequence for the rest of our life, depending on what it is. But at the same time, there's a period of time that we should be in deep sorrow for. And a lot of that goes back to, we don't understand sometimes, and I'm not throwing anyone under the bus here, I'm just saying, sometimes we don't realize how truly bad sin is. And because we don't realize how bad sin is, we're not as remorseful over it as what we should be. And so we view it as just, oh, you know, I took somebody's pencil, I'm going to give them their pencil back, we're all square and good and done. That's not what sin is. You know, sin is willfully going against God. You think about when you're a parent and you have children in the home and those children are beginning to get that freedom where they're making decisions on their own and they willfully go against you as a parent. When they come and they say, hey, I'm sorry, is that thought with you as the parent that, hey, they've willfully went against me? They've come back and they said they're sorry, but yeah, I can just kind of tell that there's not a real meaning in that. As a parent, do you immediately just say, no problem at all, let's just move on? Or is there a period of time where, like, we really hope that they are a little bit remorseful about this because we know if they are, then they're going to learn through it. It's not because we want them to be miserable. That's not what God's looking for in our life. God knows that if we are remorseful for a period of time, then we will learn from it. But if we just get to say, hey, I'm sorry, and we move on, do we learn anything in that?
You still now, the screen on the bedroom window shut.
You know, there was a point in Michael's life that we made him start writing out apologies to individuals. This is when he was a teenager. In order to get him to understand the significance of what he had said, and typically it was what he had said, to get him to understand the significance of that and the negative impact that it may have had on their life. I give you this illustration. This was when we were still at Bay, and there was a lady that taught computers type classes, and he didn't get along real well with her, just different personalities. And she was sick and actually in the hospital at the beginning of the school year. And he knew that. And so they had asked about 2 weeks in, they had asked all the students to write something to her that would let her know what would have been better about the class if she would have been there.
Let's open it up for
It was a terrible thought. I don't know who had it. And so Michael writes, if you just would have been here. And so this happened 2 years before we left over there. So we find out about it, and we make him write an apology letter to get him to understand that, like, she's sick, and you've said, you know, if you wasn't sick and you was here, it'd been better, you know. And so we get him to write this letter about it. So the last day of school in 2017, which is the year we moved, some of you may remember Michael finished, ninth grade, I guess, over there. So the first 4 or 5 months, you know, they were going to school over there, was here kind of thing. So the last day that he's there, she opens her desk drawer and pulls out his letter that says, "It would have been better if you would have been here," and hands it to him. Now that's 2 years old, and she had kept it the whole time and had the thought in her mind of, I'm going to give this to this guy the last day that I'm going to see him. And so we try to use that and talk to him about, like, you got to really think about what you do, because all these statements you make because his personality was, he was actually meaning what he said anyway, was if she would have been there, she could have taught the class, which meant we would have learned more. It would have been better for us. What it come out as was, if you weren't goofing off and being somewhere, then, you know, this thing would have been better. And so we tried to get him to think about it. When God disciplines us, God isn't looking for us to just say, "Oh, I'm sorry, move on," and be done. He's looking for us to grow in that situation and learn from it, which means there may be a period of time that we are in mourning. There may be a period of time that, you know, to use the Old Testament situations here, that we wear sackcloth or we shave our head or whatever it is. Joey's been in mourning for a long time now. He can't get out of it. He's not looking for us to say, "Oh, I'm sorry," and move on. He's looking for us to grow beyond where we were.
As adults, though, I think sometimes we do the same thing. We sin during the day, and we sometimes think that at night when we say our prayers, it's as easy as saying, "Lord, please forgive me for I have sinned and fell short today," or whatever, and move on from it. But are we really putting thought into being remorseful? And no sin is worse than any other. One that we view as simple is just as important to somebody that goes down there to the altar and asks for forgiveness.
Yeah.
And I think we sometimes take that for granted, that that's all we need to do to be okay.
Yeah, and sometimes we unknowingly, sometimes we actually teach that.
Yeah.
Because we teach about, you know, it's as simple as calling out to his name, and it is, but there is a remorsefulness within us that we have to acknowledge that it's wrong. Yeah, but I think you're right, was maybe even as parents, and maybe that's where kids learn it too sometimes, is, it is. Jennifer, I've been trying to get her to do. All right, question 7. From verse 15. Shebna was the treasurer, which meant he was second in authority to King Hezekiah. So this would have been the king over Jerusalem. Shebna was second in authority, or you might say command even. He was the treasurer. He had responsibility for the funds, said where money would be spent, where it wouldn't be spent. He had built for himself a monumental tomb. What is God saying will happen to him? And as a leader, does he bear any guilt for the decisions the people were making? So look at verse 15. It says, "Thus says the Lord God of hosts, come, go to this steward, to Shebna." So he's referencing Shebna as a steward here. "Who is over the household, and say to him, what have you to do here, and whom have you here, that you have cut out here a tomb for yourself, you who cut out a tomb on the height and carve a dwelling for yourself in the rock? Behold, the Lord will hurl you away violently, O you strong man. He will seize firm hold on you and whirl you around and throw you like a ball into a wide land. There you shall die, and there shall be your glorious chariots, you shame of your master's house. So what does God say he's going to do to this guy? Yeah, there's punishment coming, basically, and that's summarizing it very easily, maybe. But God's judgment's coming upon him individually, because if we're not careful, we look at this chapter and we say, okay, God is judging Judah as a whole. Now, we know within Judah there were some people that were probably really trying to follow God the best they could, this remnant that we talk about often. But there were also people, and this one happens to be in a leadership position, that was not doing what God wanted them to do. And so from a leadership standpoint, as a leader, does he bear any guilt for the decisions the people were making?
Yes, because he's not leading them in the ways of the Lord, and he should be.
Yeah. So we have to think about, in comparing that to our life today, and what are we leaders of today? As parents, when you had children in the home, then you have to say we were responsible for a lot of what went on in that, up to a certain age. We were responsible for what went on, and we have to consider ourselves a leader of that. Now, if we're in a workplace even, because we can't separate and say, okay, Sunday I'm going to church, but Monday through Friday I'm in work, so that's a different deal, so I'm not a leader there. We have to say, our workplace is also a place that God's put us in a leadership position. Now, obviously, we have job duties we have to do there, and we have to fulfill those there. But there's also like spiritual leadership that we can do while we're there as well, and we should do while we're there as well. So we have to keep those things in mind. As grandparents or great-grandparents, we now have, in a different way, but we have leadership responsibilities even over a family in some ways. And so we have to consider that God looks individually here, and he says, you know what? Says, Shebna, you're doing a terrible job, and because of that, here's what's going to happen. And then God says in verse 20, and that day I will call my servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and I will clothe him with your robe, and will bind your sash on him, and will commit your authority to his hand. In other words, I'm fixing to replace you, and I'm going to replace you with the guy that is going to be a follower of me. So we have to realize for our own personal life that if God has placed us, and he has, all of us, in some type of a authority type position, that we have to make sure that we're leading well. And sometimes that leading well is nothing more than when a difficult situation comes in our life, we just show that we're going to trust in God. We show that we have remorse for where we've made mistakes in our life. And sometimes that's all the leading we have to do. It's not that we have to have this big proclamation of, this is what we're doing from here going forward. It may just be that we have to say, I may have wronged this person in the past, and I need to make it right with them. And I hate that I've done that. That may be the greatest leadership that we ever put forth in someone's life, is that very thing. All right, question 8 from verses 20 and 21. Who would take Shebna's place? We already talked about that. Eliakim would. Question 9, what are we told about Eliakim? Starting in verse 21, he'll be clothed with Shebna's robe. God will bind a sash on him, and he'll have the authority that Shebna had. And then it goes on and says, he'll be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, to the house of Judah. I will place on his shoulder the key of the house of David. He shall open, none shall shut, and he shall shut, and none shall open. In other words, he has great authority from God to be able to direct and lead the people. And then question 10, even though Eliakim was a God-fearing man, what would eventually happen based on verse 25? eventually he would pass from this earth. Like he's not eternal. So this was not talking of the Messiah that was going to lead for eternity. This is talking about a human individual, but God did place authority on him for a period of time. And that's why he's a precursor to Christ. He's not Christ, but a precursor to that. And then we'll finish with verse 11, or question 11, I'm sorry. It says, going back to verse 4, what is Isaiah's reaction to learning of the fate of Jerusalem and Judah? So if we go back to verse 4, therefore I said, look away from me. Let me weep bitter tears. Do not labor to comfort me concerning the destruction of the daughter of my people. Yeah. Now, has Isaiah, yes, Isaiah has sinned because he's human, but has Isaiah committed the travesty that is being called out here of the people of Judah and Jerusalem? Probably not. Like he's a sinful man, so we can't say he's perfect. I don't mean that. But like this is a judgment that's coming upon his people. And his reaction is, man, that stinks for you. It's not the reaction we see, right? We see a reaction where he's appears to be very sorrowful. So what does that tell us today? He didn't necessarily commit the action. He cared for him. He's sorrowful for him. They were the ones that should have been mourning tremendously, and yet he's the one that is. Now think about this in your everyday life. Some of you may have seen parents who had a child that went wayward. And you see that parent actually mourning more than what the child does. Because the child is stuck in this eat and drink, for tomorrow we shall die. But the parent realizes there's eternity. And so the parent is in Isaiah's role. They're mourning, they're weeping, because they're seeing what's happening. When you look back in your own life, was there ever a time where you were Judah and there was a parent or someone else that was playing Isaiah's role for you? And they saw where you were, and they mourned and they wept. If so, we should be thankful for them because they had the care and the concern for our life. Today, you may be the Isaiah. You may be mourning, weeping for something else going on. If so, we have to know that God does send comfort even in those situations for us, but we also have to acknowledge that what the individuals have done, they have to come to an understanding of this mourning and weeping as well, which sounds very harsh, and it's not meant to be harsh. It's just reality of the truth of God's word. We mourn and weep for them because we hope that through our actions, what they see, that they will realize, that that's the reaction they should have as well. We don't do it just for that because we are sorrowful that maybe they're in a ungodly state at this moment in time. But we also have to know that they have to come to that understanding, just the same as Judah had to. And apparently, when we look at Shebna, he never came to that understanding, and therefore God tosses him out. Eliakim appeared to be a guy that had a respect for God. And, we talked about that this judgment's coming on Judah, but there were some good individuals there. Eliakim was one of them. The thing that we never do, and I think we see that with God here, because God God brings Judah into captivity, but he doesn't just say, okay, you're in captive for the rest of your life and I'm done with you. But we see that God continues to work in their life, and he continues to bring people that speaks into their life, and he restores them. And you have that remnant that continues on. So if we're the Isaiah and we're dealing with someone that is the Judah, we have to know that God continues to work and will continue to bring people, into their life. It's still up to them, but we got to be thankful that God continues to do that. And hopefully through our mourning, and when I say our mourning, I don't mean that we walk around every day for the rest of our life in a sorrowful state, but down deep, we do have a hurt for them. Just like Isaiah did. He had a hurt for them. Just like Christ did when he looks out. Y'all have heard me reference it. We talked about it, I think, last week or a week before. He looks out over Jerusalem before he makes his triumphal entry. And he knows that there's going to be some people down there that are truly worshiping him, but there's some people that are as lost as they will ever be. And he looks out over them and he says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, if you would have just understood." And yet Christ goes down. He still, he has that mourning for those who don't, but at the same time, he also has the compassion for his apostles that are trying to follow him. And so he has I'm not going to say it is a joy, but it's not how we would think about laughter maybe necessarily, as he goes through the Last Supper with them and talks through them through all of that. Any questions or comments down through there? If we tie this together, just to finish, and it's not a question on your sheet, but to tie this past Sunday together with this, because chapter 30 that we preached on Sunday is a continuation of what we just studied. And God says, "You stubborn people, you're now trying to make an alliance with Egypt. You're looking for other avenues now to try and avoid what you really need to do." And we have to ask ourselves, do we find ourselves in this stubborn state sometimes with God, to where maybe we're not opening ourselves up to learn what we need to learn in the situation that we're in, and maybe sometimes we just have to take a step back and say, "God, show me what you're trying to show me through this so that I can be who you're wanting me to be in this moment in time." And so sometimes it's not always that we have the answers, sometimes that we have more questions than we do answers. And that's okay. Because again, in all of our situations, God is trying to work to grow us in some way. And if we gain growth out of it, even though we may not understand why it happened the way it did, but if we gain growth out of it, then we've progressed in our relationship with Him.
The last few words of that chapter where the Lord was spoken is very telling. He said, we just need to know that His will is going to be done.
Yeah.
And we need to seek that.
Yeah, that's right. And you know, that's a very, it's a very humbling statement for the Lord has spoken, because it is saying, this is it.
That's powerful.
It is very powerful, yeah. When the Creator of the universe says, "For I have spoken," it's all, if you want to relate it to your own personal life, maybe there was a time with your children where you had these conversations and they were trying to talk you into letting them do something, and you were listening to them, and it was kind of going back and forth. You know, you're giving pluses and minuses, and then you kind of get to the point where you're just like, okay, this is the way it's going to be. And that's pretty much what that statement is. The Lord has spoken. Not that we're Lord, but you know what I mean by that. And there's coming a time where when Christ steps out, that's what will be said as well. I mean, it won't be those words, but basically Christ returns and this is it. And God's spoken, it's time. And then for some it will be too late. So we mourn now for those in hopes that it will not be too late for them. All right, let me pray for us. Heavenly Father, we do come to you today once again. We thank you for this time you've given us to look to your word.